If you've ever asked somebody how much money does it actually cost to buy a home, you've probably gotten quite a few different answers, and rightfully so. There are so many different factors at play per each transaction, but in this video, I'm breaking down every cost from offer acceptance to the closing table. All the expected costs, the unexpected costs, and the ones that probably no one has warned you about yet. So let's get into it. So let's say you've just gotten your first offer accepted on your first home, and at this point, this is when the process really gets moving. Within 2 days of that offer acceptance, the first expense you can expect to pay is going to be your earnest money. So typically in Minnesota, we see anywhere from like 1 to 3% of the purchase price being put down in earnest money. And earnest money is basically a good faith payment. This money kind of shows intent to the seller that you are serious about buying this home. So with that, the more earnest money you put down, kind of the more intent that you're showing, the more like serious you are about this home. In a very competitive market, in a hot market as we say, more earnest money could be a very compelling term to get an offer accepted. If a seller is looking at two offers and they are literally the same thing, except someone's offering $1,000 in earnest money and someone's offering $3,500 in earnest money, there's a really good chance that the seller will lean towards this offer over here, just as there's more earnest money thrown on the table. So what happens with earnest money? Like I said, in Minnesota, within 2 days of offer acceptance, earnest money is due. That money is typically held by the listing broker or a title company, and that money gets deposited into an escrow account. I think it's important to note that you're not losing this money the second it gets deposited into this escrow account. This money does get applied to your down payment or your closing costs, so there's no need to look at it as just like an extra fee. In Minnesota, the median home price right now is around $400,000. Typically, first-time home buyers are probably more in the like $350,000 range, but just for the sake of keeping the numbers easy, we'll base this off a $300,000 purchase price. So if you're buying a $300,000 home and you have agreed to put down 1% in earnest money, you're looking at $3,000. And that is kind of going to be your first expense throughout this home buying process. And because, like I mentioned, this money is due within 2 days here in Minnesota, this cash needs to be liquid. By liquid, I mean it needs to be accessible. It needs to be cash on hand, sitting in a bank account, ready to spend right now. It can't be money that's tied up in investments or in like an account that may take days to withdraw from. This needs to be cash on hand, baby. As I mentioned, this earnest money does get applied to your down payment or your closing costs when you get to closing day. But I think a lot of people are curious, well, what were to happen if I don't get to closing day? What if we back out of the transaction? What if something falls through? Well, fortunately in Minnesota is a very buyer-friendly state, and there are a lot of contingencies that can be put in place to ensure that you as the buyer don't lose your earnest money. If you have opted to do an inspection and there's an inspection contingency on your offer, you have until within that inspection period to do all of your inspections, read through the inspection report, and then decide if you'd like to continue with the transaction, if there are maybe some concessions you'd like from the seller, maybe some repairs you'd like the seller to make, or in the event that you find something detrimental and you want to back out of the transaction, if it's within that inspection contingency, you can back out for any reason at all, and that earnest money will be refunded to you. So it is nice to know that you wouldn't be losing out on that $3,000. You'd still be out the money that you paid to get that inspection done. There can also be appraisal contingencies or financing contingencies where, once again, if something were to happen within that window and you had written in and there were contingencies in place that say you would get your earnest money back in the event that your financing falls through, or if the home doesn't appraise at the agreed upon value and you did have an appraisal contingency in there, then in that event you would also be getting your earnest money back. It wouldn't be totally forfeiting. But if you back out of the transaction outside of any of these contingencies, or if none of these were in place, that is when you are at risk of losing your earnest money. And like I mentioned, earnest money is due very shortly after that offer does get accepted. So it is important to make sure that you actually have that money on hand, like I mentioned earlier. So first expense, earnest money, $300,000 house, you're doing 1%. So currently right now you're looking at about $3,000 in. So now that we've established earnest money, the next expense you're going to be looking at is the inspection cost, the cost of getting the inspection, assuming you're not waiving it. So typically how I do things, earnest money is due within 2 days. So pretty much as soon as the offer gets accepted, as soon as you can, you should be thinking about getting that money deposited ASAP, just so it's out of the way. And almost in tandem with that, I usually work on scheduling the inspection. So typically an inspection contingency window is usually within 5 to 10 days. 7 days or a week is pretty typical, but in that 7 days, you need to schedule the inspection, get everything done, read through the report, and then decide if there are any items that you would like to ask from the seller. You have to get that written up and signed and sent over to them before the end of day of that last day in the inspection period. So that's why I think as long as you're getting your wallet out to do the earnest money, let's get this inspection scheduled, because that is another expense that does not get rolled into closing. That is something that you have to pay for up front. Now, the general home inspection is a non-invasive inspection, meaning the inspector doesn't open up any parts of the house, meaning he's not going to cut a hole in the sheetrock and check the plumbing, behind the shower. They don't remove any flooring. They don't take apart any of the major appliances. It's all based on what is visible to them at time of inspection. And what happens in the general inspection is a licensed inspector will go through the home top to bottom and check all the major systems. This being the HVAC, the roof, the foundation, the plumbing. They'll look inside the electrical panel. They'll check all interior and exterior structures that they can see. And this is to identify any safety issues or any needed repairs on the home. Now, these don't guarantee perfection, but it does give you as a buyer just a better understanding of what's actually going on in the home. There are 2 other add-ons that we typically see here in Minnesota that you can add to your inspection. One of them being the sewer scope, which is where an inspector will basically put a camera down your main plumbing line and follow it all the way down to the city connection. And what they're doing is looking for any root intrusion, any cracks, any settlement, anything like that in the sewer line. And why I think these are so important, especially in an older home, is that your sewer line may be the most difficult thing to see in the home, obviously because it's underground. And with that, to get your sewer line repaired in the event that something does happen, it is almost for certain one of the most expensive things that you can have done on your home. Like at minimum $5,000 to fix something in the sewer, and that can easily go up to like 20 grand. The sewer scope can cost somewhere between like $200, $300, something like that, which to me, I'm just like, hey, that is like money well spent once you know like how much money it can cost to actually repair a sewer line. I think $250 in the grand scheme of things is like money well spent. Even if you don't find anything, it's like, well, now I have that peace of mind. And then the third most common add-on we see in an inspection would be radon testing. Compared to the rest of the country, Minnesota has very high radon levels. And since radon can be so bad for you, I think it's always worth it to get a radon test done just to see. Again, a radon test will add about $175, $200 to the inspection. But I'll say it again, I think that's just money well spent. Even if it comes back and it's like, hey, you're fine, you don't need a mitigation system, it's like, cool, well, at least you know now. And it's definitely not uncommon to see mitigation systems already in homes. A lot of people have already installed them. They're not too expensive. I think a new system is between like $1,500 and $2,000. And in the event that the test comes back and you are above those EPA recommended action levels, as they say, there's usually a good chance that the seller will be open to installing a mitigation system prior to closing. Not always, but I've personally had pretty good luck with it from sellers. I think a lot of that is because it's just like it's a harm. It's an active danger in the home. So it makes sense that sellers are usually pretty willing to do that. Currently, that important number that they're looking for is 4, the number 4 picocuries per liter. Full disclosure, I'm not 100% sure on what that measurement looks like, but for what it's worth, even the EPA says there's no safe level of radon. So even if you're reading somewhere between 2 and 4, that can still be considered a health hazard. There are some other inspection add-ons that you can do as well. These are a little bit less common just because they don't apply to every home, but there are chimney inspections, there are well and septic inspections if you are on well water, and also you can test the water quality if you are in fact not on a city water system. So what's the total cost of an inspection? So typically just the general inspection alone, I would say you can expect somewhere in the ballpark of $350. Obviously this is different, this isn't a set number, but somewhere in that ballpark. The sewer scope can add, like I mentioned, maybe $250. A radon can be another $200-ish. So just to be safe, let's say out the door you're looking at about $1,000 for the full inspection. I'm also just going to round up to the nearest thousandth just to kind of make things a little bit more digestible. So earnest money, $3,000. Inspection, you got the general inspection, you're doing the sewer scope and the radon. You're looking at about $4,000 as it stands. And again, just to go on record, $1,000 is not the set standard for an inspection. It could be more like $750, it could be $1,200 depending on what you do, but just keep things easy. We're gonna go with $1,000. So good news, we have paid our earnest money, paid for our inspection, we got through inspection, everything's hunky-dory. Now what happens? So once you're through inspection, once the contingency window is closed, if there's an amendment to be had, it's signed by both parties, fully executed. Once that happens, your lender is going to order an appraisal. For the record, if you're paying cash, you don't have a lender, you don't need an appraisal. But for the sake of this video and for the sake of probably the people that I'm talking to, we're using financing, we're working with a lender. So we're through inspection, lender orders the appraisal. To get a fully completed appraisal, that can take anywhere between like a week or two, maybe some more days. And most lenders will require that to be paid for upfront. Sometimes you can roll it into your mortgage, but an appraisal can be anywhere between like $400 to like $800 on the really high end. So it's not a crazy amount of money to have to cough up front, but it's not nothing. It's still, you know, $500. What can cause an appraisal to be more expensive? Kind of depends on the size of the house, the size of the lot. The price can vary depending on where it is in the state. Multi-family properties, so like duplexes, triplexes, things like that, those can be a little bit more expensive. Or if it's just like a unique property, that can kind of shift the cost on the appraisal. Now, if you don't really know what an appraisal is, that's great, so I'm going to explain it to you right now. First things first, you should know that an appraisal is meant to protect not only you, but also the bank. And it's there to protect both of you to make sure that no one is overpaying for this home. So how it works is there's this pool of appraisers out here, and the lender will order an appraisal for your specific property, and somebody gets picked out at random and goes and appraises your home. I think they do this to keep it non-biased, you know, kind of just even ground. They're coming in, appraiser has no stake in the game. And basically what it is just an independent estimate on the home. Their job is to determine if the value of the home is at list price, it's at the agreed upon price that you're buying it for. Maybe they think the home is worth more, maybe they think the home is worth less. And based on that, it can kind of change things as far as the transaction goes. Now, I won't get too into the weeds on this, but just to help kind of wrap your head around this, if the appraisal, and I should say this, typically, not always, definitely not always, but typically if you're not paying like $50,000 over list price to get a home in a really crazy market, if you're in the ballpark of the list price and the home was priced accurately, more often than not, the appraisal will just come back at value, which means, hey, you guys are buying this home for $350. I agree that it's worth $350. Done deal, and the loan keeps going on through underwriting. Now, where it can get tricky, especially as the buyer, is if the home comes in below the agreed upon value, then somebody is on the hook for that, what we would call an appraisal gap. And why that happens is because, let's say you're buying a home for $300,000. The appraiser comes out and says, hey, I only think this house is worth $275,000. Well, your lender in the bank, they're only going to loan on that appraised value amount. So that means you're on the hook to buy this house for $300,000. You're only getting $275K financed. So we got to figure out what's going to happen with this $25K. So then from there are a few things that can happen. One, you can cover that appraisal gap. You can say, hey, I'm going to pay an extra $25,000 and we're going to be good to go. That has to come out of my pocket. You can also try and renegotiate the price with the seller. You can say, hey, we agreed on $300. They're saying $275. If you can't afford to cover that appraisal gap, which wouldn't be crazy, then you are now, having to try and renegotiate the price with the seller. Or there could be an event where the seller and the buyer both agree to like split that appraisal gap. So each person would pay, you know, $12,500 to kind of keep things fair and also just keep the transaction from totally falling apart. Because there is the situation where you can't cover the appraisal gap, seller doesn't budge on price, they don't want to cover that appraisal gap either, and now the deal is kind of just dead in the water. And you as the buyer may have no choice but to just back out. And hopefully there's an appraisal contingency in place so that you don't lose your earnest money on top of having lost all this time and effort trying to get through this transaction. So that's usually, I mean, you know, obviously transaction falling apart, that's a worst case scenario. But the third thing that can come out of the appraisal is that it could actually appraise higher than the purchase price value. So let's say your $300,000 home, the appraisal comes back and it says, hey, I think this house is worth $325,000. Well, what does that mean for you as the buyer? Honestly, high five. Good news, you're kind of getting instant equity in your home. You're getting a screaming deal on the home. You didn't pay what it's actually worth, so, you know, good for you. And from there, the loan will just proceed normally without any changes, and you can know that like, hey, yeah, I got a good deal on this house. Now, depending on the type of financing you're using can mean different things for your appraisal. And what I mean by that is if you're using a VA loan or an FHA loan, those two in particular have specific appraisal processes and different appraisers that will come out and do the appraisal. I just said appraisal way too many times. Now, if you don't know, a VA loan, 0% down for the buyer. So the VA is covering the entire cost of the home. So obviously they're going to do a little bit more, I wouldn't say in depth, they're just a little more strict with the condition of the home. They really want to make sure that everything is structurally sound, everything is safe, there are no hazards in this home because they're risking the most in this whole process. FHA loans, kind of similar. They are coughing up a lot more money at the front, so they're going to want to make sure, just like VA, that things are up to code, things that are safe, the house is not in shambles, and that it's not unsafe. It's in working order and in a very livable condition. Okay, so now hopping back into the actual home buying process, we are earnest money deposited, inspection period paid for and done. The appraisal has been ordered and it is done. Came back in value. Pretty cool. We'll say $500 was the cost of the appraisal. So now all in, you're looking at about $4,500 to get through appraisal. And now prior to actual closing day, that is all the out-of-pocket expenses you can expect to pay. But now as we move towards closing day, you're looking at maybe the biggest out-of-pocket expense depending on your loan type and your situation, but that is going to be the down payment. The dreaded down payment. So like I said, the down payment, depending on your situation, can be the biggest cash requirement. However, it's also the most flexible depending on your loan type. If you're using an FHA loan, you're looking at about 3.5% of that purchase price as a down payment. If our purchase price is $300,000, you're looking at about $10,500 for a down payment using FHA. A conventional loan, you're looking at somewhere between like 3 and 5% down. Could also be 10, could also be 20, kind of depends. And like I mentioned earlier, VA loan, 0% down. But something very important to note, especially as a first-time home buyer, here in Minnesota, they offer several down payment assistance programs. Most of those programs are offered through the MHFA, the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency. And when buyers use their programs, for example, the startup or the step-up mortgage programs, they can add a down payment loan ranging anywhere from like $14,000 to $18,000. And that can either be a monthly payment loan or a deferred loan with no payments. So if you've ever heard someone say, hey, you can literally buy a house for $1,000 in Minnesota, they are referencing utilizing one of these programs. And this isn't a joke. I've literally helped clients, my friends, get into homes for like $1,000. And personally, I think like the coolest thing about this is just how attainable it makes home ownership for most people. At the top of the video, I said, if you've ever asked anybody how much does it cost to buy a home, you've probably heard a wide range of numbers, and it's because of things like this. Obviously, buying a home for $300,000 doesn't mean you need to have $300,000 sitting in your bank account, because at that rate, I mean, most people wouldn't have a home. And I'm sure you've heard someone say, well, you have to have 20% down. Okay, that again can like keep a lot of people out of home ownership, because 20% of $300,000 is 60 grand, and that's quite a bit of cash to be sitting in a bank account just ready to go towards a down payment. And so if you're able to utilize these programs for down payment assistance, you can use that as requires like insane leverage to get into a home. And like I said, these down payment loans, they can be set up as like a 10-year monthly payment type thing or a deferred no monthly payment at all. There are some stipulations with that in order to not have to pay back that loan. Sometimes you have to live in that home for X amount of years. Most of these programs require a first-time home buyer online education course. And these are just a couple examples of down payment assistance programs. There are other ones that, depending on your situation, you could get approved for. There's a first-generation home buyer program, which have in the past offered forgivable 0% interest loans up to like $35K. Although depending on the availability of funds, these kind of open and close. So these aren't necessarily programs that are always at the ready. And like I mentioned, there are some caveats with these programs. Typically, the home needs to be owner occupied. If you do have a deferred loan, that unpaid amount is typically due when you go to sell, refinance, or if it stops being your primary residence. Like I mentioned, a lot of these programs require the buyer to take a home buying online education course. And it's definitely important to note that you need to make sure you're working with a lender that participates in these financing programs. Otherwise, you may not have accessibility to them. So very important to check with your lender way early on in the process if you do plan to use a down payment assistance program. Now, before we get to the last out-of-pocket expense that you can expect to pay going through the home buying process, I just want to say thanks for watching if you're still here. My name is Paul Winkleman. I am a realtor here in Minnesota. I work on the To the Twin Cities team, and my main focus is kind of helping first-time home buyers understand the process, work through the process, and help people realize that home ownership is not an unrealistic goal and is far more attainable than most people think. So I appreciate you watching. If you have any questions, if you want to reach out to me, if you want to say what's up, whatever, you can reach out to me through email, paul@tothetwincities.com. Find me on Instagram at paul2thetwincities. But please feel free to reach out, ask me any question. I'm always down to talk, always down to help anybody. And yeah, I appreciate you watching this video. So last expense that we're looking for is going to be closing costs. And I do have a video all about closing costs, breaking down each little thing, what it means, how much you can expect to pay. So I won't go insanely in depth on this, but what are closing costs? For starters, closing costs are typically around 2 to 4% of the purchase price. And I'm going to rapid fire go through basically everything that's included in closing costs. Your closing costs are made up of lender fees because your lender's been working hard behind the scenes for you, getting the loan through underwriting, processing, and origination. If you chose to buy discount points to buy down your interest rate, that'll be included in your closing costs. There will be title company fees. Again, people that have been working behind the scenes, absolutely crushing it on your transaction. And they're charging for settlement fees, closing fees, and the title search. You're going to be paying for title insurance, which is required on the loan unless you put more than 20% down. You'll be paying recording fees that are charged by the county in which the property is in, credit report fees, mortgage registration tax, which I'm pretty sure is unique just to Minnesota, and then maybe any wiring fees or courier fees depending on how you actually closed and how you sign on the home. It's worth to note that these costs can vary depending on the county. Typically in Hennepin and Ramsey County, like in the immediate metro here, you can expect to see a little bit higher fees on a lot of those things. So with some of those down payment assistance programs, they can cover both that down payment and the closing costs. Again, that's a great question for a lender. It kind of just depends on your specific situation because the assistance is kind of designed to reduce the total cash needed at closing. So that would include the down payment and the closing costs. This isn't consistent all across the board. It depends on the program you use. And let's say you aren't using a program that's going to cover your closing costs. Well, there's a few ways in which these can shake out. There is a spot on the purchase agreement on your offer where you can write in any seller paid closing costs. And what that means is you're basically asking the seller to contribute part of the money from the sale to pay your closing costs. Now, I think it's very important to know that this is never guaranteed, never a for sure thing, never expected. It's another term that you can negotiate in the contract. And there are a lot of outside factors that can kind of influence whether or not the seller will in fact contribute to your closing costs, pay all of them. And a lot of that depends on the attention on the home, how long it's been on the market, maybe the time of year. If there's a lot of competition on that home, there's a good chance that someone might not ask for seller paid closing costs. I think it's very important to be upfront with whoever your agent may be that you're working with. If getting closing costs are something that's very important to you, then I think that's a strong thing to establish right away, because it can kind of shift how you write offers or even like the kind of homes that you're looking for. Like I said, homes that have been on the market for quite a bit longer, you as the buyer have a little bit more leverage because there's a higher chance that that seller is like, okay, I need to get this house sold as we've been holding on to it for so long, and they're maybe more willing to like make a little bit more negotiation in that regard. There are also ways that you can kind of structure your deal to make it that you're not necessarily paying your closing costs and you're not also taking a net of the proceeds from the seller. Using a $300,000 house, for example, let's assume you have 3% in closing costs, so that's $10,000 on a $300,000 home. You can offer $300,000 and ask the seller to pay 3% in your closing costs, which would then lower their net by $10,000. Now, in a multiple offer situation, it's hard to say if the other offer or offers are asking for closing costs as well. If they aren't, if they're getting list price and no seller paid closing costs, they're going to, most likely go with the offer that nets them $10,000 more. But if you have a little bit of flexibility in your budget, you can structure your offer to say, hey, you're asking $300,000, we're going to offer you $310,000 for the home, but we're going to ask for 3% in seller paid closing costs. That way it kind of levels out. They're still netting what they want, and you're also getting your closing costs covered. Obviously, this shifts your monthly payment a little bit, but the numbers in which your monthly payment will change versus having to pay $10,000 out of pocket can kind of be like a no-brainer in order to keep the seller happy, get your offer accepted, and also not break your bank. It is important to note that these closing costs, seller paid closing costs, they don't do anything for your down payment. It's strictly for the closing costs. And with that, they also don't refund anything beyond what you owe. So what I mean by that is if you ask for 3% in closing costs, but it turns out your closing costs are only around 2.5% of that purchase price, you're not just going to get 0.5% added on to your credits. That money is just going to cover up to what you owe in your closing costs, and then that's it. And maybe this goes without saying, but you can't use seller credits for inspection, appraisal, inspection fees, and this must be negotiated in the purchase agreement. And like I mentioned, in a competitive market, asking for closing costs from the seller can definitely weaken your offer. But if you're looking in a time where it's a buyer's market, they're definitely easier to get agreed upon. So once you're aware of all your closing costs and what that dollar amount is going to be, you are then going to find out your final cash to close amount. Your actual cash to close amount until the end of the process, because it depends on quite a few things. Prorated taxes, insurance quotes, the interest rate being locked by your lender, the exact closing date can change those numbers. Obviously, the earnest money can change those numbers. How many months of taxes you need to put into escrow required by your lender can also change that. And then whether or not you got any of those seller credits or lender credits. So your final cash to close number is calculated using your down payment, your closing costs, and then that earnest money, seller credits, and any lender credits. Your lender will provide you with the official CD or closing disclosure, which will outline all the fees, all the numbers, everything will be calculated on this form, and it will show what that number is that you need to bring to closing. You can expect this at least 3 days before your closing date. And then from there, you're either wiring your funds or bringing your money order to the closing table and signing about 100 documents and receiving your keys. I hope this was helpful. If you've watched to the end, seriously, I appreciate you, and I will see you in the next video.